host is Jim Mars.
Howdy, I'm your host today here on Dreamland on a very special occasion because today we're going to hear from Doug Horne. Doug was the Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board. And to just set the stage, let me explain that in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, of course, within a week, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, hand-picked a committee headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren and called the Warren Commission. Prominent people on there such as John J. McCloy and Allen Dulles, who I find particularly interesting since Kennedy had fired Dulles from his position as CIA director in the wake of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, and some others. And they concluded after about 9 months that the assassination was the work of Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted alone. This was called into question almost immediately. And a few years later, we had the Jim Garrison investigation in New Orleans, and the jury, who was polled afterwards, unanimously said that Garrison had convinced them that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but they could not bring themselves to believe beyond a reasonable shadow of doubt that Clay Shaw was part of it, so they found him not guilty. But this even raised more questions, particularly with some of the witnesses and information that came out in the Garrison trial. So then in the mid-'70s, Congress founded the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and they said they went through a lot of turmoil, changed leadership, and Blakey, the new chief counsel, started off by saying they weren't going to consider any new evidence. Anything new, they didn't want to hear about it, but they would re-examine some of the old evidence. Well, that forced them into considering the Dallas police radio tape, which according to 2 separate sets of acoustical scientists showed clearly that there had been shots not only from the Scobert Depository, but also from the infamous Grassy Knoll. But the House Committee said, well, we're, out of funds, we're out of business, and they encouraged the Justice Department to continue their investigation. This was not done. In fact, all the Justice Department did was convene a hand-picked committee of National Science Academy people who tried to call into question the Dallas police tapes. A few years later, in a peer-reviewed paper in England, they called into question the conclusions of the National Academy of Science Committee. So the whole thing has just been in controversy and turmoil ever since. And finally, in the early 90s, we had the Oliver Stone film, JFK, which was based on Jim Garrison's book and my book, Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy. And in the wake of the controversy that stirred up, Congress then named the Assassination Records Review Board. And this was a group of citizens who were tasked to go into government files and find anything that pertained to the Kennedy assassination. Unfortunately, they were also instructed not to do anything with it. Don't make any conclusions. Don't present any of their findings or conclusions to the public. Just put all the stuff in the National Archives, and maybe 20 or 30 years later, some diligent researcher might actually find something. Well, Doug Horne is the man. He is not only a diligent researcher, he was the Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board, which put him right in the thick of what they were finding out about the Kennedy autopsy, which of course was done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And he even had opportunity to speak with and interview some of the people involved in the autopsy, and he was also privy to the examination of one of the most critical pieces of information, evidence, the famous Zapruder film taken by Abraham Zapruder. So, Doug, I apologize for that long-winded introduction, but now that we've laid the groundwork, tell us what you found in your work for the Assassination Records Review Board.
Well, thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, and don't apologize. The case is a mess, and it's been made into a mess by all those investigating bodies. So what I found, Jim, was that and these are my conclusions, after working for the review board for the last 3 years of its 4-year lifespan, and my conclusions after researching and writing this book for 13 years, this book Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, available on Amazon.com. It's my conclusion that the reason the case has never come together like a normal homicide case is because there's massive fraud in the evidence. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, but it's backed up in my book by overwhelming evidence of not only fraud in the evidence, but what that means is a massive cover-up of the medical evidence by the U.S. government. And specifically a cover-up of the fact that the president was killed by a crossfire and that evidence of shots from the front was suppressed and only evidence of shots from the rear was admitted into evidence. So the listeners may be wondering, well, what do you mean by fraud in the evidence? And to summarize very, very briefly, without getting inside baseball too much, there are 3 skull x-rays of the president, and those 3 are not originals in the National Archives. They are copy films. They are altered copy films made from the original skull x-rays and altered in such a manner that the blowout in the back of the head, the exit wound behind the right ear, seen in Dallas by all the doctors and nurses, has been hidden in the x-rays. It looks like solid bone, but we know they're forgeries. Number 2, the autopsy report's been rewritten at least twice, so the version in the archives now is the 3rd written version, and the particularly disturbing to me is the fact that the brain photographs in the archives, purported to be of President Kennedy's brain, cannot be of his brain, as proven by the testimony of 2 key witnesses. One of the FBI agents who was at the autopsy, Frank O'Neill, said they can't be of President Kennedy's brain because there's way too much mass present. There's too much tissue present in the organ in the photographs. And the photographer who took the pictures said, no, these can't be the pictures I took because they're taken on the wrong kind of film and they're taken from the wrong angles. And they also don't show the sections that were made of the brain. So those are 3 key areas where there's fraud in the evidence. There are others, but that's it in a nutshell.
Okay. So in other words, what you're telling me is that when somebody steps forward and says, yes, but look, this government document states thus and so, you cannot take that to the bank, can you?
That's correct, Jim. Normally the autopsy report is the medico-legal record of someone's death. In this case, it's not true, since we know at least 2 written versions of the autopsy report, a typed first draft and the first signed version, have been destroyed.
Right.
The autopsy report cannot be used to explain how President Kennedy died.
Right. Okay. Well, that's step number 1. We'll go to step this up to number 2 right after this.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland with expert host Jim Mars.
Howdy. We're back here today. This is your host, Jim Mars. We're talking with Doug Horne, Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board, and he's just informed us that the autopsy on President Kennedy has been altered, fabricated, changed at the level of the federal government. So, Doug, tell us how you know this.
Sure, Jim. We know from the testimony taken of Drs. Humes and Boswell. There were 3 pathologists at President Kennedy's autopsy. 2 of them were Navy, and they were the lead doctors at the autopsy, Drs. Humes and Boswell. The 3rd guy was kind of an outsider. Dr. Fink worked for the Army, and he arrived late after the autopsy had started, and he was basically a consultant advising the 2 Navy men. So we took the testimony of all 3.
Excuse me, had any of these military doctors had any kind of extensive experience with gunshot wounds?
Almost no. Almost no is the answer. Drs. Humes and Boswell, the 2 lead pathologists, had no practical experience in forensic autopsies of people killed by trauma, by gunshot wounds. They had only done autopsies of people due to death due to natural causes. And Dr. Fink, the consultant, was a board-certified forensic pathologist, but number 1, he arrived late after much of the work had been done, Number two, he did not do this every day. He only reviewed reports written by other people. So there was almost no practical experience in forensic pathology during the autopsy on the 35th president, which is really appalling. In retrospect, I believe this was intentional. You can steer the conclusions of people who aren't really qualified in the first place, not only because they're in uniform and they're following orders, but because they're not forensic pathologists. The two lead pathologists were not.
Is it true that they were, when I think it was Frink, or one of the autopsy doctors, there was some argument going on about what to do, how to do it, and he said, well, who's in charge here? And a military officer said, I am. Is that true?
Well, that's correct. During the Shaw trial, Dr. Fink had a rough time on the witness stand, and the first day he testified, he made that statement under oath. He said, I said, who's in charge here? And Dr. Fink recalled that Humes, the lead pathologist, had said, who's in charge here? It, irritated with all the interference during the autopsy and the people giving orders, and that Fink said under oath, an Army general said, I am. He tried to back away from that during his later testimony at the Shaw trial, but it was too late. He had already said it under oath. And in fact, we know he was being coached. I mean, he was doing so badly on the witness stand that, in terms of telling the truth that other people didn't want him to tell, that they called Dr. Boswell down and had him waiting in the wings to take over and to get up there and rebut Fink if necessary. So Boswell revealed to us under oath something we didn't know, that he was called down there by the Justice Department to help with the defense team, and was waiting in the wings because Pierre Fink was doing so badly.
So 5 testimony.
Yeah, so to make a long story short, yeah, Dr. Humes admitted in 1964 to Arlen Specter, to Assistant Counsel Arlen Specter on the Horne Commission, admitted that he burned the first draft of the autopsy report in his fireplace on Sunday, the weekend of the assassination.
Mm-hmm.
The problem for Humes is that during the House committee period in the mid-'70s, he changed his story. And he said, well, I destroyed the notes in my fireplace. I destroyed notes because they had the blood of the president on them, and he thought it was unseemly. Well, that's a conflict right there. So when he testified before us, General Counsel Jeremy Gunn really bore in on him on this subject, and Humes finally admitted that he destroyed both the first draft and notes. So that's the first. And by the way, Dr. Boswell told us under oath that the first draft was actually typed. I mean, it was prepared on Saturday. Boswell told us under oath it was prepared Saturday and reviewed by he and Humes. And we also know that a third party, Dr. Canada, the commanding officer of the hospital portion of the Bethesda complex, those 3 men reviewed it on Saturday. Humes destroys it in his fireplace the next morning, early Sunday morning. So that's the first version that's been destroyed. The second version was a signed version that was given to Robert Kennedy in 1965 by the Secret Service at his request. He was a senator at that time from New York. And then a year and a half later, when he was required to turn over all the autopsy materials he had in his possession back to the government so they could be put in the archives, he returned the photographs and x-rays, but he did not return a signed version of the autopsy report, along with what was left of the brain and other biological specimens. So he kept part of these materials, and they'd never seen the light of day again. So
what you're telling us is that standard operating autopsy procedures were not followed in the case of the JFK assassination.
Certainly not with the evidence. I mean, the evidence was made by the government. It should never have been turned over to someone's family. And then when they returned it to the government, and the government knew immediately that he had not returned all the materials, and that he had kept biological materials, tissue samples, the brain, plus a signed autopsy report, they didn't go after him. They just let it go, which was appalling. So we know that the next year, in 1967, the year after the Kennedys returned the materials to the archives, the next year the Secret Service turned over an original autopsy report to the National Archives, and that's the one we have today, and that's the third version. In other words, Jim, if there's only one autopsy report, no one can give it to someone else twice. So you have the Secret Service on record giving a signed autopsy report to Robert Kennedy in 1965, and then he keeps it and doesn't give it back. And then the Secret Service turns over another signed autopsy report 2 years later to the archives. And that's the version that's on file now, and therefore I conclude that's the third written version. So that's just completely unacceptable.
Do you think the third version, which is now the official government version, do you think it accurately reflects what was actually found at the Kennedy autopsy?
Oh, no. It is the version that concludes that a bullet transited the body, and that was not a conclusion, from back to front, from the upper back out the throat. That was not a conclusion at the autopsy. The FBI agents were there, and they wrote their own report, and they know that was not a conclusion during the autopsy itself. And I don't believe that was a conclusion in the version that Robert Kennedy sequestered either. So that was one conclusion that evolved. And of course, there's no mention of any shot from the front in the autopsy report that exists today. And I don't believe there was in the earlier versions either, because that evidence was suppressed during the autopsy itself. I mean, the cover-up began the moment the body arrived. So no, the conclusions were evolving, and that's why you have different versions, and all that's laid out in Chapter 11 of my book.
Okay, so they altered the autopsy report. What about the president's body? There has been some speculation there may have been alteration to the body. Do you have any knowledge of that?
There was, Jim. I consider it a certainty now. This concept was first raised in 1981 by David Lifton in his outstanding book, Best Evidence, which he worked on for 15 years. By the way, it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It didn't win, but it was nominated, which was remarkable. Mm-hmm. And given the subject matter. And Macmillan at the time was very brave to publish that book. So Mr. Lifton believed that the wounds on the head had been altered before the body arrived at Bethesda. And my conclusion is that he was close, but he wasn't really correct. And I've altered my view of this because we just know more now than we did in 1981. We know a lot more based on the ARRB's depositions and interviews. I've concluded that, yes, the head wounds were altered by surgery, by post-mortem surgery after death, but it happened at Bethesda before the autopsy began. You see, there was a long period of time, Jim, between the time the body actually arrived and the time the autopsy started. The body arrived at 6:35 p.m. We know that because of a report written by a Marine security guard, Sergeant Boyajian. And so it arrives at 6:35 p.m. The autopsy doesn't begin until 8:15 p.m. And there's a lot of time there for shenanigans to take place, and the shenanigans were taking place. We interviewed Tom Robinson, one of the morticians, who prepared the body for burial after the autopsy. He was there for the whole period. He was there for the whole autopsy. We also deposed the two X-ray technicians, and one of them, Ed Reed, both Ed Reed, the autopsy tech, and Tom Robinson, the mortician, they both surgery to the president's skull, done by Dr. Humes. And from the way they described the details of that surgery, it's clear that what Dr. Humes was doing was expanding the exit wound that was seen by the Dallas doctors and nurses, expanding that wound dramatically to 5 times its original size, so that now there's a large defect on the top of the president's head and on the right side, which was not present in Dallas. The reason for him doing that, the primary reason, was to get to the brain and remove evidence of a shot from the front, remove the entry wound in the upper right forehead with an incision, remove the entry wound in the bone, remove part of the skull plate, and remove bullet fragments from the brain. And along with it, a lot of brain tissue was removed. So and in the process of doing this, you've got a much larger skull defect when you're finished with this illicit surgery. And that large skull defect is then misrepresented by the camera and in the autopsy report, misrepresented to history as, quote, damage caused by an exiting bullet, unquote. So this large defect done by the doctors, which Tom Robinson, the mortician, was adamant about. He looked at the autopsy photos and said, all this damage at the top of the head, he said, this is not what the bullet did, this is what the doctors did. He was there. He knew that.
So what you're telling us is that these alterations, these shenanigans, as you call them, they certainly could not have been done by Lee Harvey Oswald or by the Russians or by the Mafia or by the anti-Castro Cubans, right?
Exactly. And to prove that point, Jim, I'll make it brief here, but the body left Dallas in an ornate bronze viewing casket, very heavy, over 400 pounds, made of bronze, with the top half that opens up for viewing. And it arrived at Bethesda in a different casket and in different wrappings. It arrived in a cheap aluminum shipping casket, and instead of wrapped in sheets, wrapped in a body bag with a zipper. So the body was not only, intercepted en route, where I believe the throat wound was. There was an entry wound in President Kennedy's throat, seen in Dallas by all the doctors, and that was tampered with before the body arrived at Bethesda. But after the body arrived, the skull wounds were tampered with by the pathologists themselves. So that makes it very clear. That interruption in the chain of custody makes it very clear that this is an inside job by the government.
Right. That's amazing. Okay. Well, we'll proceed along to step 3 in this analysis of the Kennedy assassination when we return right after this.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. Expert hosts, unique information.
Howdy. This is Jim Mars. We're back here again on Dreamland, and we're talking today with Doug Horne, Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board, and we are learning some amazing things, that the basic evidence in the Kennedy assassination cannot be trusted. Doug, let's move on to the Zapruder film. What can you tell us about the Zapruder film, which has been called the clock of the assassination?
Right. For the first 30 years or so after it was taken by Mr. Zapruder, that one preeminent film of the assassination, the only one of the films that really shows any detail of any kind, it was studied, the image content was studied for the first 30 years, and people wanted to know, what can it tell us about what happened? So for the first 30 years, the debates about the film were about the image content. For the last 15 years or so, the debate has been really, is the film authentic or not? The whole territory of the debate, the structure of the debate has changed dramatically, and it's my conclusion, after working for the review board, after we commissioned a limited, I emphasize limited authenticity study of the film by Kodak, and after studying his report raises more questions than it answered. It's a very biased and flawed report, and I write about that extensively in my book, in Chapter 14. And it's my conclusion today, for 2 reasons which I'll enumerate in a moment, that the film is an altered film, altered to hide evidence of an exit wound in the back of the president's head. It's been blacked out in the film, and altered to actually paint on a false exit wound in the right front of his head, which mimics, not perfectly either, which generally mimics the enormous damage in these fraudulent autopsy photos, which show really the results of surgery. So the real exit wound behind President Kennedy's right ear in the back of his head has been blacked out on the film. A false exit wound has been painted onto the right front and the top of his head to mimic the autopsy photos. And because those alterations are so apparent now, which for reasons I'll explain in a moment, they're so apparent, all the other things, Jim, that we thought we knew about the film for 30 years are suspect now. So the first generation of researchers who studied the film and who spent, countless hours, hundreds of hours studying this thing frame by frame, concluded there was a timing problem, and that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly were shot too close together to have been done by the same rifle, and that therefore their reactions to 2 different shots occurring very close together was evidence of multiple shooters from behind. That was the original conclusions of the first generation researchers. But I got to tell you, Jim, there are some 50 witnesses or more that the limousine came to a complete stop during the motorcade for an instant, for a second or 2.
Correct.
And that's not seen in the film today. So if a car stop has been removed as well, and by the way, something else that's not present in the film that should be. Everyone in Dealey Plaza who had their eyes focused on the president at the moment he was killed, the one thing they all described that was common was massive amount of exit debris leaving the back of his head and traveling to the rear. Everybody that watched the murder described that one thing. Their descriptions would differ in other ways, but that was the one thing their descriptions had in common. You do not see any exit debris leaving the back of President Kennedy's head and traveling to the rear in the Zapruder film. So if the car stop has been removed, which it may have, and if the exit debris leaving the back of his head has been removed, I should say that they're not present, so therefore I suspect they've been removed. I mean, I know that the head wounds have been altered on the film, so I don't necessarily trust the early conclusions of the research community that there's a timing problem in the film. If time has been removed from the film by removing frames, to remove a car stop and to remove exit debris traveling in the wrong direction, then the old argument about the timing problem it's just suspect. And I submit to you that it's no longer the primary evidence in the film of conspiracy. The primary evidence of the film of conspiracy is the alteration of the head wounds. That's the big story now, and that's the new story that's in my book. And
that's true. And the thing that proves that to me is the testimony of not only the police officer Bobby Hargis, who was riding to the immediate left rear of Kennedy. Right. But also witnesses who saw him that day, and he was splattered with blood and brain matter, and he told people that he was so hit with debris that he thought he had been shot.
That's right. He thought he'd been shot, and both he and Martin, both of them, to the left rear, were covered with blood and gore, and so was the rear of the car, the trunk lid. So the listeners may be wondering, why am I so certain the film's been altered? The primary reason is because a patriot named Sidney Wilkinson, a lady in the film industry in Los Angeles, purchased from the National Archives a 35-millimeter duplicate negative, certified to be accurate, certified to be gold standard, the real deal, from the National Archives last year. She then assembled an ad hoc research group in Los Angeles, people from the motion picture industry. Nobody, Jim, had ever done this before. It's remarkable that it took 46 years for someone to do this, but she did it. And
these people in the film industry, they had no real knowledge and no real particular concern about the Kennedy assassination.
They had no vested interest. They were not researchers who had staked out a claim for or against authenticity. They hadn't written any books on the subject. Most of them hadn't thought much about it in decades. But these are people that know motion picture films. They had no axe to grind. And Jim, 7 out of 7 people now that have viewed the digital scans that she made high-definition scans of each frame of the Zapruder film from her dupe negative. 7 out of 7 experts now, experts in the post-production of motion pictures, people who know what special effects, visual effects look like. 7 out of 7 people that have viewed it now say that the film, the head wounds, are not only altered, but they're badly altered. The alterations were very poorly done. And,
well, they were probably done very hurriedly.
Very hurriedly, and in fact, I know how hurriedly, because the other part of the story proves that the chain of custody of the film isn't what we thought it was, and that instead of being sent directly to Life magazine the day after the assassination, like we thought it was for years, instead the film went to Washington, D.C., to the CIA's primary photo analysis facility, the NPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center. And briefing boards were made Saturday night, the 23rd of November, 63, from the original 8mm film. That's what you would expect. The problem is that the next night, at the same facility, another Zapruder film was brought. This is Sunday night now, the Sunday night before the funeral. Another Zapruder film was brought 24 hours later to the NPIC, and those controlling that evolution brought in a whole different group of workers. Not one single person who had been present the night before was present Sunday night. A different group of workers, and the film presented was no longer an 8mm film. It was a 16mm wide AA film, but it was as yet unslit. So this was an altered film, Jim, masquerading as a camera original. And if the agent that delivered it to the NPIC the second night for a second set of briefing boards to be made said it came from the CIA's secret photo lab at Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York, called Hawkeye Works. So that's a heck of a story. That a second original film, but was developed at a place where we know the original really wasn't developed. The original was developed in Dallas, Jim, and it was slit to 8 millimeters on the day it was developed. So a second Zapruder film is brought to the CIA's lab in Washington Sunday night. It's double the width it should be. It's masquerading as right out of the camera, just developed in the wrong city, in Rochester. So what you have, I think, is an authentic set of briefing boards of what the film really showed made Saturday night. And then you have a sanitized set of briefing boards made Sunday night in the same building by a different group of people. Sanitized group of briefing boards made from an altered film. And that's a heck of a story. So we have...
How difficult would it have been to take these, when you say briefing boards, I'm assuming you're talking about like they could photograph each frame and blow it up to like an 8x10 or whatever. They could then mess with it. How difficult would it be then to photograph each of those doctored frames and shoot them frame by frame with the Zapruder camera and then be able to argue that it came from his camera and therefore it was an authentic film?
Yeah, the alteration question is one that's still being researched. The Hollywood experts, there were two ways, Jim, to do a visual effect in a motion picture in those days. Of course, we didn't have any digital technology yet. So the two ways to do it was by traveling mats or by aerial imaging. The people that believe the film was altered, the 7 Hollywood experts who have seen it so far, they believe aerial imaging was probably the technique used. It's much simpler than a traveling mat. And it's my personal opinion after reading film school textbooks from 1965, talking to these people in Hollywood, is that it was possible. That's my opinion. It was possible to alter the head wound images within one day using aerial imaging. Now,
can you explain aerial imaging? What are we talking about?
Yeah, very simply. I'd love to. If you take a film. Aerial imaging, Jim, let me start over. Aerial imaging is done with a device called an optical printer. Optical printers are used to copy motion picture films by projecting the original image through a lens and then recording it in another camera. So optical printers are almost always customized, and many of them were customized to handle aerial imaging. So in aerial imaging, you have this big Rube Goldberg contraption about 6 feet tall, very heavy, bolted to the deck. And you're going to project the original film from below. It bounces off a mirror at a 45-degree angle and comes straight up through the air through a condenser lens. On top of the condenser lens is a glass plate on which you can do animation. So if you're projecting an original film from below, frame by frame, it's coming through condenser lens through a glass plate about 7.5 by 10 inches. You have acetate frames laid on top of the glass plate. You do your artwork, you block out part of the head, you paint on a false wound on each acetate frame, and you rephotograph this composite image from above in a process camera. So you have a playback camera down below, a process camera up above. But the aerial imaging only requires one pass through the new camera. So you retain good visibility, good resolution. It doesn't take as long that way. And you don't have registration problems because it's self-matting. Now, that's a little bit of inside baseball, but it's all explained in Chapter 14. And so aerial imaging was, I believe, feasible to have been done within a 12-hour period, providing you used a Bell & Howell 8mm home movie camera as the process camera. And I believe that's what happened.
Yeah, since they had the Zapruder camera, then you could use that as the processing camera, right?
Well, Jim, I don't recall sitting here right now when the government took the camera, whether it was that weekend or a week or two later. But yes, as long as you had a Bell & Howell camera, yeah. Well, as long as you had one, you were set. And
okay.
So if other things were altered in the film, if time was removed by removing frames, if the car stop was removed, if exit debris was removed coming out the back of the head, which I believe it surely was, some of those things may have taken additional time, but we do know that the first alterations were done by Sunday night because it's the Sunday night version of the film from which the INPIC employees made their briefing boards, the second set of briefing boards. We know from examining a surviving briefing board from Sunday night that the blow-ups they made of the Zapruder frames are the same as the crude pictures in life the next week. The black and white pictures published by Life the next week. So the initial set of alterations was done by Sunday night, rather hurriedly, I do believe. And the pictures in Life that week and the pictures in the second set of briefing boards are identical. So it's clear that many alterations, probably the principal ones, were done on Sunday, November 24th. And I think that's why they're crude and they're not well done. And I think that's why Life magazine suppressed the film as a motion picture for 12 years.
Right. I wanted to point out that as far as the public is concerned, no one actually got to see the Zapruder film run as a film for a dozen years.
That's right. It was only shown to the Warren Commission on a shaky movie screen. The old-fashioned home movie screen with an 8mm projector. The original was looked at 3 or 4 times, and the rest of the time the Warren Commission had to use a copy. And Life magazine, after spending an extra $100,000, basically tripling the price, to buy it a second time. They bought it Saturday for $50,000 for print rights only. They bought it 2 days later on Monday for $150,000. They paid an extra $100,000 in 1963 dollars for motion picture rights, and they never once in 12 years displayed it as a motion picture for profit. Once the bootleg copy of the film was shown by Robert Groden and Geraldo Rivera and Dick Gregory on television in 1975, Life said forget it, and they sold it back to the family for $1. So because the heat was on them at that point, is why did you suppress this back into the left motion on the president's body? So they said, we don't want any more to do with this. But I believe that's one of the main reasons it was suppressed for 12 years is because the alterations were so poorly done that if it had been loaned or used to show it as a motion picture, that those using it and showing it may have detected the fraud.
Exactly. Let me add this quick. Here's a little coda. Just a few days ago, I received an email from a fellow who is the nephew of a man who was an investigative reporter for Life magazine, and he was telling me how his uncle suspected conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination and was trying to pursue that angle when he was called off, told to forget it by his immediate superior at Life magazine, who it turns out, and he was told, was a close friend of Clay Shaw.
Oh, my God.
The man who was prosecuted by Jim Garrison. So we see the interconnections that were taking place at that time, which, of course, the public has never been privy to.
Wow. Jim, that's amazing. I'm speechless. I'm speechless. There's one other thing I should point out about the film. I think the head explosion, the infamous head explosion in frame 313 is artwork. I don't think it's real. It only lasts for 1 frame. That film was running at over 18 frames a second on the average. It was running 2 frames a second fast. A real head explosion would have registered on at least 4 or 5 frames of movie film. Maybe 7 or 8 frames, half a second. That explosion only lasts for 1 frame. It's impossibly short. And it actually, if you look at the scans made by the Hollywood group, it actually occurs, the explosion is centered forward of the president's skull, actually outside of his head. So the artist that did that head explosion did a lousy job, and they painted it in the wrong place on the frame. And it just doesn't fly. That dog does not hunt, Jim.
It just does not hunt. Well, that's amazing. Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, Doug, I'm going to ask you, what do we do about all this now? We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is the Edge of the World.
Howdy. This is your host for today, Jim Mars. We've been talking to Doug Horne, Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board, who has just blown us away with his knowledge and his conclusions that the Kennedy assassination was an inside job, and that the most basic evidence, the body, the Zapruder film, has all been altered by elements within the federal government of the United States. Doug, where do we go from here?
Well, there's 2 possible avenues. I mean, the one is to do what we've always been doing for people that are fascinated and sometimes even obsessed with this evidence, to keep studying it and keep writing about it, and that's what I'm doing.
Right.
But
and
the other,
tell us where we can get your book.
Oh, sure. I had to go the self-publishing route because I wanted to publish a 2,000-page book. So my book is 5 volumes, But I don't want people to be afraid of that. It's very accessible. It's written for the ordinary person. So you can get it only at Amazon.com, and they'll print it upon demand within one day or a day and a half at the most of when you order it at Amazon.com. They'll print it and it'll be in the mail to you. And each volume is very reasonably priced. So you can buy one at a time, two at a time, or all five. But just put in my last name Horne and the word JFK. Horne, JFK, Horne, JFK, and all five volumes will pop up.
That's great. I've noticed already that there are the debunkers, the naysayers, yes, even perhaps the hired minions who are on the internet saying, oh, well, Doug Horne, he's just fantasizing and he's just drawing bad conclusions and yada, yada. How would you respond to them?
Well, no, I'm not a medical doctor, Jim, but I'll tell you what, I've been studying the case since 1966 when the first critical books came out. And I had a man who's an MD review the work. He did peer review of my book while I was writing it. Learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from the 5 medical consultants hired by the review board staff while we were in session in the 1990s. And I had a board-certified radiologist peer review my chapter on the X-rays. So I'm pretty confident that I'm not blowing smoke. And I would invite anyone who isn't sure, or even someone who's skeptical, read all the books. Read the Warren Report, read the House Committee Report, and read my book and make up your own mind. Don't fall into the trap of allowing someone else to characterize my work. Their goal is to get you not to read it. So make up your own mind. I believe that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I've provided the evidence. That's why the book is 5 volumes and 1,880 pages of text and 90 illustrations. So people can decide for themselves whether I'm qualified or not.
Well, that's certainly reasonable enough. At this point, go ahead and give us your bottom line. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about coup d'etat?
Yeah, we are, Jim. It's not a pretty story. It's an ugly story. I don't think the government will ever admit to this because it's just too unpleasant. And unfortunately, the people in succeeding administrations, they always seem to think the American people can't handle the truth. In my view, what the American people cannot stomach the most is lies. I've pursued this case for decades because I hate being lied to. I just hate it with an intensity that I cannot describe. So I think people can handle the truth, particularly 46, 47 years later. And if we're going to understand our real history, we need to come to grips with what really happened to JFK and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And the nation hasn't done that yet, as a whole. So, I believe we had a coup d'etat, and I believe it was over the. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, we've kind of been all in a state of denial, haven't we?
We are a nation in denial. We're a nation that's a little bit naive. We should be ashamed of ourselves. We're more interested in our mythology about ourselves and believing our mythology about us being the greatest democracy on earth, and bad things don't happen in our country. They only happen in other countries. That mindset is one I cannot tolerate after having studied all this evidence. The evidence, everything that's wrong with this case is what drove me to conclude that there was a coup. I didn't start in 1967 with the conclusion there was a coup, and I'm going to go cherry pick the evidence that said there was. It was the other way around. The evidence drove me toward my political conclusion, which I reached about 10 years ago. And this coup d'etat in America, Jim, occurred at the height of the Cold War, and it was engineered by a consensus, I hate to say this, a wide consensus of people in the national security establishment within the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies that President Kennedy was weak on foreign policy. They thought he was dangerous, and that they were very upset that he wanted to end the Cold War and not win it. Yeah. And to these people, winning the Cold War not only meant winning the space race or the peace race. It meant winning hot wars like Vietnam, Laos, Cuba. It also meant possibly even nuking the Soviet Union, the first strike, preemptive first strike against the Soviet Union. This was the mindset that was confronting JFK, who these people viewed President Kennedy by the third year of his administration as a very dangerous change agent.
Right, and if he had ended the Cold War, not only, just think about the billions and billions of dollars in defense that they would not have made.
Yeah, you're not kidding. So I view the intelligence cold warriors and the high level people in the Pentagon who all opposed him so vociferously and to his face quite often, who opposed him as jihadists. They were our holy warriors of that time who wanted to defeat communism on the battlefield. I mean, a Cold War wasn't good enough for these people. They wanted victories on the battlefield because of the frustrating stalemate in Korea in 1953. And when they realized he wasn't going to give it to them in Laos, he wasn't going to give it to them in Vietnam, and he wasn't going to even invade Cuba, these people were absolutely fit to be tied. And when he began, to formally try to end the Cold War in 1963 with the peace speech in June 63 and the successful sponsorship of the Test Ban Treaty and getting that through the Senate at the end of that summer, that was it. I mean, and the final straw was probably the fact that he was negotiating back channel with Castro to try to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba, providing the Russians would leave. So they did not want to see this man reelected.
Right. Okay, look, Doug, let me ask you this. Do you feel like that those same forces, maybe not the exact same people, but their families, the power groups, the financiers, the bankers behind them, their minions, are they still in power today?
The same mindset is certainly in power. The simplistic mindset that says the best solutions are military solutions. I don't believe that myself, but there are people around, as we know from studying the last decade, that the neocons certainly believed that, and they're still around. They're waiting to take power again as soon as Obama leaves office. So, yeah, that same mindset is still with us.
Yeah.
That military solutions are the best ones, and that we want to. We not only people with this mindset don't really care whether people like us or not. They want people to fear this nation. And, of course, they have plenty of support from all the corporate interests who want to continue making money hand over fist from money pissed away on arms programs.
Right, and the occupation of other key countries that may be sitting on oil deposits or gas pipelines or even the poppy fields, right?
Yep, that's right.
Amazing. All right, Doug Horne, thank you so much. This has been an extremely enlightening discussion, and I personally appreciate what you're saying. As far as I know, you were one of the first government officials who has seen the inside information and has come out with the courage to say, hey, this is an inside job, this was a coup d'etat, which of course fits all the known facts. I certainly appreciate that, particularly myself, because of course, going back to I think I published an article in 1975 that said this is a coup d'etat, and of course I was the conspiracy theorist, but it turns out that the conspiracy theorists were more right than wrong.
They certainly have been, and in the 60s, Mark Lane and Josiah Thompson blazed the trail, and then they were followed by, along with Jim Garrison, and they were followed by you and David Lifton and many others, and I'm standing on the shoulders of you people. So we have to keep fighting the good fight, Jim.
Well, truth will out, and I'm like you. I haven't been in it because I had any preconceived ideas. I've been after the Kennedy assassination because from the get-go I realized something was not right about all that, and all I wanted was the truth. And I submit and I reinforce and reiterate what you said, which is don't believe us. Just study the facts and study the material. Come to your own conclusions.
Right.
Doug, thank you so much. I appreciate you being with us today. And this is your Dream
admitted into evidence. So the listeners may be wondering, well, what do you mean by fraud in the evidence? And to summarize very, very briefly, without getting inside baseball too much, there are 3 skull X-rays of the president, and those 3 are not originals in the National Archives. They are copy films. There are altered copy films made from the original skull X-rays and altered in such a manner that the blowout in the back of the head, the exit wound behind the right ear, seen in Dallas by all the doctors and nurses, has been hidden in the x-rays. It looks like solid bone, but we know they're forgeries. Number two, the autopsy report's been rewritten at least twice, so the version in the archives now is the third written version. And the particularly disturbing to me is the fact that the brain photographs in the archives, purported to be of President Kennedy's brain, cannot be of his brain, as proven by the testimony of two key witnesses. One of the FBI agents who was at the autopsy, Frank O'Neill, said they can't be of President Kennedy's brain because there's way too much mass present. There's too much tissue present in the organ in the photographs. And the photographer who took the pictures said, no, these can't be the pictures I took because they're taken on the wrong kind of film and they're
evidence, the famous Zapruder film taken by Abraham Zapruder. So, Doug, I apologize for that long-winded introduction, but now that we've laid the groundwork, tell us what you found in your work for the Assassination Records Review Board.
Well, thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, and don't apologize. The case is a mess, and it's been made into a mess by all those investigating bodies. So what I found, Jim, was that, and these are my conclusions, after working for the review board for the last 3 years of its 4-year lifespan, and my conclusions after researching and writing this book for 13 years, this book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, available on Amazon.com. It's my conclusion that the reason the case has never come together like a normal homicide case is because there's massive fraud in the evidence. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, but it's backed up in my book by overwhelming evidence of not only fraud in the evidence, but what that means is a massive cover-up of the medical evidence by the U.S. government. And specifically a cover-up of the fact that the president was killed by a crossfire and that evidence of shots from the front was suppressed and only evidence of shots from the rear was...
Toast is Jim Mars.
Howdy, I'm your host today here on Dreamland on a very special occasion because today we're going to hear from Doug Horne. Doug was the Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board. And to just set the stage, let me explain that in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, of course, within a week, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, handpicked a committee headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren and called the Warren Commission. Prominent people on there such as John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles, who I find particularly interesting since Kennedy had fired Dulles from his position as CIA director in the wake of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, and some others. And they concluded after about 9 months that the assassination was the work of Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted alone. This was called into question almost immediately, and a few years later we had the Jim Garrison investigation in New Orleans, and the jury who was polled afterwards unanimously said that Garrison had convinced them that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but they could not bring themselves to believe beyond a reasonable shadow of doubt that Clay Shaw was part of it, so they found him not guilty. But this even raised more questions, particularly with some of the witnesses and information that came out in the Garrison trial. So then in the mid-'70s, Congress founded the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and they said they went through a lot of turmoil, changed leadership, and Blakey, the new chief counsel, started off by saying they weren't going to consider any new evidence. Anything new, they didn't want to hear about it, but they would re-examine some of the old evidence. Well, that forced them into considering the Dallas police radio tape, which according to two separate sets of acoustical scientists showed clearly that there had been shots not only from the Schoolbrook Depository, but also from the infamous grassy knoll. But the House Committee said, well, we're, out of funds, we're out of business, and they encouraged the Justice Department to continue their investigation. This was not done. In fact, all the Justice Department did was convene a hand-picked committee of National Science Academy people who tried to call into question the Dallas police tapes. A few years later, in a peer-reviewed paper in England, they called into question the conclusions of the National Academy of Science Committee. So the whole thing has just been in controversy and turmoil ever since. And finally, in the early 90s, we had the Oliver Stone film, JFK, which was based on Jim Garrison's book and my book, Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy. And in the wake of the controversy that stirred up, Congress then named the Assassination Records Review Board. And this was a group of citizens who were tasked to go into government files and find anything that pertained to the Kennedy assassination. Unfortunately, they were also instructed not to do anything with it. Don't make any conclusions. Don't present any of their findings or conclusions to the public. Just put all the stuff in the National Archives, and maybe 20 or 30 years later, some diligent researcher might actually find something. Well, Doug Horne is the man. He is not only a diligent researcher, he was the Chief Military Analyst for the Assassination Records Review Board, which put him right in the thick of what they were finding out about the Kennedy autopsy, which of course was done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And he even had opportunity to speak with and interview some of the people involved in the autopsy, and he was also privy to the examination of one of the most critical pieces of information